One day in 1989, a group of tourists were on a yacht trip and suddenly saw a floating body on the surface of the water from afar. When they got closer to it, they discovered that it was the body of a woman. The police were notified, and after searching, they found 3 bodies of 3 women in the same area. The victims' legs were tied with a rope, and the rope was connected to a cement block. The search for the criminal took a long time, but in the end, the police will expose us in a strange and unique way. Personally, I have never seen anything like it before, and I think it is the first of its kind. This story has very exciting events, so watch it until the end, because it has many surprises. Hello, I am Fernando. Before we get into today's story, I must give you this warning. This story talks about a crime, and also has an element of assault on women. I think you understand what assault means. I will not go into detail about this aspect during the events, but we will mention some things that the story may need in order to be understood in the end. This is a real story. Whoever is uncomfortable hearing such things, it is better not to continue the video. The story dates back to 1989, meaning it is an old story. A few events took place in the American state of Florida, a state that is almost considered a peninsula surrounded by water from all directions, so it attracts many tourists throughout the year, and most of these tourists are found in marine areas. One of these areas was a city called Tampa. A group of tourists were going on a sea trip on a line, and suddenly, they were enjoying the atmosphere and enjoying themselves from afar. They saw a strange object floating on the water. They approached it, and were surprised that it was the body of a dead woman. They immediately called the Coast Guard. The body was not far from the coast, maybe about 3 kilometers. The Coast Guard arrived and retrieved the body of this woman. They were surprised that there was a bandage or tape on her mouth, and her hands were tied with a yellow rope. What was worse was that her legs were tied with a cement brick, which means that someone tied her up and threw her into the sea, and drowned her intentionally. Of course, the procedures in this case are for the Coast Guard to search the surroundings of this area to look for any evidence or anything that might be related to the crime. During their search in the area, they found 2 additional bodies were also women's bodies, and the same thing in the same way. They were gagged and bound, and their legs were tied with a cement brick, meaning that this crime had 3 victims. The first thing the police noticed was that the clothes on the bottom of the 3 victims were removed, so they assumed that they had been assaulted before they were thrown into the sea. What's worse is that their lungs were full of water, which means that they were drowned while they were alive. That means that they were not thrown into the sea after they were killed. They were thrown and drowned under the water, and the killer had deliberately tied this floor to them so that they would sink to the bottom. So this was not just a crime. It was like an execution. On top of that, their eyes were not blindfolded or covered, meaning that each one of them saw the other being thrown into the sea, as if the criminal was enjoying and delighting in increasing the pain and psychological torment on them. You will say, well, how did their bodies float to the surface of the water while the floor was still tied to them? The answer is that after the body dies and begins to decompose, it releases internal gases. These gases inflate the body from the inside and make it like a balloon, so the body floats. Even the heavy floor was not able to keep them under the water, but when they were still alive, the weight of the floor was more than enough to pull them under. The second thing that the police noticed was that the 3 victims had similar features, so they concluded that they were most likely relatives, and most likely that they were a mother and her daughters, because one of the victims appeared to be older in age, while the other 2 victims appeared to be teenage girls, and their bodies were not. Their bodies were carrying anything, or any papers that indicated their identities. Now the police's mission is to identify who they are. They found no way other than to announce the incident in the media. Of course, they did not publish their pictures or pictures of their bodies because the bodies had already begun to decompose. However, they published that 3 bodies had been found, an elderly woman with 2 teenage girls, believed to be her daughters. They asked anyone who had information about them to contact them. It wasn't long before the police received a call from the manager of one of the hotels in the area, a hotel called Days Inn. The manager of the hotel told the investigators that a customer had not taken a room with her 2 daughters. It had been 3 days since they had seen any trace of them. When the cleaning ladies entered their room, they found all their belongings there and left as they were, as if they had disappeared. No one came and said, "Why didn't they call them?" Keep in mind that we were in 1989. At that time, mobile phones were not widespread. They were present, but few people used them, and it wasn't even practical. The network coverage was good. The important thing is that the police went to the hotel, and there they found the identities of the mother and her daughters. The mother's name was Joan Rogers. Her eldest daughter was named Michelle, and she was 17 years old, and her youngest daughter was named Christe, and she was 14 years old. After they found out their identities, they found out that they had originally come from another state, Ohio, which was more than 1,500 kilometers away from Florida. It is clear that they had come for tourism. But the question is, why were the investigators able to contact the father, who was Joan's husband, and whose name was Hal Rogers? This is a picture of the family together, but it is an old picture from years before the incident. Even the girls were the youngest. Hal and his family were all together running a farm in Ohio, a dairy farm, meaning it had chickens and cows. Running this farm was exhausting work and required constant work throughout the year without stopping. There was no day you could rest, unless someone took care of the work. The animals needed daily care, so when the mother and daughters wanted to take a vacation and change the atmosphere a little, the father did not have the opportunity. They went out with them, because the farm needed someone to take care of it, and their financial circumstances and the income that came in from the farm was not enough to hire workers or people to help him, so he could not leave the farm at all. So the mother and the girls went on this trip by themselves. The father's behavior was very strange. I mean, he made them go on this long trip by themselves. They were supposed to return on June 1st, the date they had agreed on. But a day, 2 days, 3 days passed, and there was no sign of them. Here comes the strange thing. The father did not even try to contact the police. I mean, if any other father, or any person, put yourself in his place. If your family was going on a trip and set a specific time for them to return, if they did not return on this time, you would immediately start to worry, and most likely you would go and inform the police the next morning. But this father did not care. 3 days passed without him moving at all, and in the end the police were the ones who contacted him to tell us what happened. The investigators were surprised by him, and felt that he was too cold, especially after they heard the news, and his response to them was, "By God, I don't have time to be emotional now. I have a farm to manage." And they went and continued their normal work on the farm as if nothing had happened. There was a person who just lost his family, not just one person, but 3 people. There was no emotion. I told the police that he didn't have time to be emotional. He had a farm to leave. Strange, strange, strange. This is the first time I've seen a father this cold. How can you not feel even a little upset after your wife and young daughters killed him in this horrible way? Let's assume that there are problems between him and his wife Dot, and he doesn't love her. Let's assume this. Okay, and your daughters, your young daughters, one is 17 years old, and the other is 14 years old. He kidnapped them, and did what he did to them, then killed them in this way, and threw them into the sea. Their lives are not to be mourned, even a little. So the investigators immediately suspected him. In family crimes, relatives are always the first people to suspect them, and even you now. I'm sure that many of you are thinking that he is the killer, but the investigators, after investigating him more, confirmed without a doubt that he had nothing to do with the crime, and that he had not left the town in the past few days. First of all, the town they live in is located in the state of Ohio, and is more than 1,500 kilometers away from the state of Florida, where the crime occurred. So for the father to go and come back would take at least 2 days. And the town they live in is a small town with hundreds of residents. Everyone knows the other. And the father used to go and eat at the restaurant every day because he doesn't know how to cook. His wife was the one who cooked for him. So people used to see us every day. And there were many witnesses. They confirmed that they saw him in the restaurant, the supermarket, or other places around the town on a daily basis. It is impossible for the father to be the killer. One was surprised by this cold reaction. He did not show any feelings, and immediately went back to his work on the farm as if nothing had happened. Some psychoanalysts say that this might have been his way of dealing with sadness and pain. He tries to drown himself in work and the daily routine that he is used to in order to forget because the shock is greater than he can comprehend. But he still appears to this day in some interviews, and you feel that he speaks in a cold manner, and he also appears as if he is not affected. You even feel that he is smiling while talking. Anyway, apart from the father, let us return to the crime. Forensic experts examined the bodies to try to obtain any evidence on them, but unfortunately, any trace that might have been present, whether fingerprints, hair, or DNA, was all lost with the water. These bodies remained in the water for 3 days, and that was enough to erase any trace that might have been present on them. The police were also looking for the mother's car at the time, because they knew that she had a car. After searching, they found her car at a small boat port on the coast. They know that most likely the mother and her daughters boarded a boat from this port, and the boat was most likely owned by the criminal. This port was a small, public port, and even what they call a port, they call a place where boats launch. That is, boats do not stay parked here in this place, but they can come and stop for a while and pick up passengers and go straight away. Anyone who had a boat could use this place. There was no registration or subscription. It was a public place. Anyway, they found the mother's car parked in front of this small port, so the police started searching it and going around inside it. Here, I want you to focus with me. Okay. The police found important things in the car. They found 2 papers written on them in handwriting. Each paper was written in a different handwriting. That is, 2 different people wrote on them. The first paper was a map, or instructions and directions. Also, written on it in handwriting were directions to the location of the hotel where they were staying. As for the second paper, it was written on directions to the location of the port, this port in front of which the car was parked. Of course, the investigators took these 2 papers and gave them to forensic specialists to analyze the handwriting. The paper that had directions to the location of the port written on it was written in the mother's handwriting. That is, the experts had samples of the mother's writings and confirmed it. After comparing, this was her handwriting. As for the second paper, which was a map, and had the location of the hotel written on it in handwriting, this was written in the handwriting of another person, an unknown person, and the way of writing was, for example, in the word Courtney that you see in front of you, the letter T. In the middle of the word was a capital letter, and this was strange, because capital letters are preferred at the beginning of the word, but writing a capital letter in the middle of the word is something strange. In addition to the letter T, the letter Y was also written in a strange way. There were 4 Y letters in the writing, and each letter was written in a different way from the other in a clear and distinctive way. This means that the unknown person who wrote these hotel directions had a very distinctive handwriting, so the police focused all their attention on these two papers because they felt that they could lead them to the killer. In any case, the two papers were the only clue they had. Let's go back to the first paper, the paper that the mother wrote on, and on it were directions to the location of the port that they found at the car. The last two words on this paper were written blue and white, meaning blue and white. Okay, they were going to a port or a boat launch site. What could be blue and white? It must be a boat. The investigators immediately concluded that this was the color of the boat. They then began to collect some information. Then the police received a report from the person. This man told them that there was a man living in the area who was working in a commercial or business without a license and was using this port or the place from which the boats depart. This business was to take tourists on sea trips at sunset. This man's name was Jason Wilcox, and he had a blue and white boat. After the police investigated him and his background, they were surprised to find that he had a criminal record and had even entered the record before on the basis of a physical assault. After they investigated his address, they learned that he lived about 8 kilometers from the small port. So the police went to his house and surprised him. There, they saw the boat in the yard of the house, and next to the boat were pieces of cement bricks, similar to those they had found tied to the bodies of the victims. Of course, Jason denied any connection to the crime, and without real material evidence against him, the police were unable to do anything to him. They could not even ask him to give them a paper with a handwriting written on it, so that they could compare it with the handwriting of the unknown person, but the investigators continued to monitor and follow it. During their investigations, a new thread appeared. Of course, the story of the crime became known, and the victims published their pictures in the media, and even hung large billboards in the streets. If you provide information that leads to solving the case, you will be rewarded with a prize of $25,000. The police were sitting every day receiving a large number of calls and reports from people, most of which were of course useless and did not lead to anything. But someone came forward with important information. This person was actually a Canadian girl who was also coming to Florida for a tourist trip. This girl's name was Judy Blair, and her picture was not published in the media. This girl actually filed a report with the police about an assault incident that happened to her on a boat. This incident happened only 2 weeks ago, about the murder of Joan and her daughters. The Canadian girl says that she was coming to Florida for a tourist trip with one of her friends. One day, while they were walking in the area, a man approached them and started talking to them. This man seemed to be kind and nice. He told them that he had a business of taking tourists on boat trips at sunset. The girl's friend who was with her refused the offer and said, "No thank you." As for her, the idea of the boat, the sea, and the sunset seduced her, and she felt that the view would be unmissable. And indeed, the sunset view from the boat in the middle of the sea, it would be something nice and special. But I mean, you are a girl in a strange country, and you go out alone with a stranger on a boat in the middle of the sea. Why? I don't know. Some people are better at hugging each other, and maybe it's just the passage of time. I mean, at that time it was different. I mean, this was before the age of the internet, so there was always people hear about stories of criminals and crimes. Anyway, this Canadian girl went on a sea trip with a strange man. When they were on the boat alone in the middle of the sea, and no one was around them, the man took out a knife and put it to her neck and threatened her that if she did not let him do whatever he wanted to her, he would kill her. The criminal wanted to assault her, and told her not to think of any crazy ideas and try to jump into the sea and swim. The water is full of sharks, so the girl kept pushing him back and begging him to leave her alone. In the end, this assault happened. Fate got the better of her. After that, she sat by herself in the corner of the boat and covered her face. The criminal waited in pain until darkness fell. Then he moved the boat and returned towards the shore. When they were a short distance from the shore, he ordered her to get into the water and swim. The investigators say that he most likely did this to remove any traces of it from her body. All her fingerprints would be erased. Any hair or DNA that they might find would be gone. The girl also went to the police and informed them that she had not returned to the hotel and took a shower, and then went to the police, meaning that any trace that might have remained of the assault was gone. No DNA could be found on her that they could trace. So when she went to the police after that, they couldn't ask her anything, and she didn't have any information about the criminal. The only thing she knew was his appearance and the sketch or drawing that they draw of the criminal. Now, after the police opened the investigation into this girl's affair, 2 weeks later, the second crime occurred, which was the murder of Joan and her daughters, and it appeared in the media that the boat was blue and white. So the same thing. The criminal in the Canadian girl's case had a blue and white boat, so this girl went back to them again and told them, "I am sure that this killer in this crime is the same one who assaulted me." The investigators were actually convinced that the criminal in both of these cases is the same person. Now, the Canadian girl has become a key witness in the case. She's the only one who saw the criminal's appearance, so the first thing the investigators did was show her a picture of Jason Wilcox, the person they suspected. As soon as the girl saw her picture, she said, "No, Jason, this doesn't look like him, the criminal who assaulted me, even if we compare his appearance to the sketch that the police draw." The scenarios were not close, and in the end the police brought Jason to the police station and gave him a lie detector test, and he passed the test. He also had an alibi in absentia, Some people saw that he was sitting with them on the day of the crime, so Jason Wilcox was acquitted of the charge in both cases. The drawing that was drawn of the criminal's face led to many calls from people who believed that they saw the criminal or knew him. The same thing happened with the blue and white boat, which brought many calls, because there are many boats that are blue and white, so the number of reports that were reaching the police and that they had to check on was crazy, They later discovered that one of these reports was true. The criminal's neighbor recognized him from the drawing and called the police and reported the problem to them, but I don't know what happened exactly. It seems that the police did not check him at all, or they checked him quickly and excluded him, even though the criminal was in their hands, so they imagined that they received a true report. But this report did not lead to his arrest, and certainly the amount of reports that were reaching them daily played a role in this mistake. Although the criminal was in their hands, the free man looked free. Imagine that the situation continued like this for 3 years. 3 years, and the case was not solved. Now we have reached the year 1992, and in that year the case was still open. But of course the situation was not as effective as it was in the beginning. They were not working on it with the same intensity. At that time, they were receiving reports. So one of the investigators who were working on the case had a strange and unique idea. Remember the paper they found in the mother's car, which was a map with handwritten instructions for the location of the hotel written in a distinctive handwriting? Remember that paper? The police believed that the killer was the one who wrote on this paper, and that this was a plan, and since the handwriting is very distinctive, there was a possibility that someone would recognize him. So what did the police do? They went and hung 5 large billboards in the streets. They printed the writing that the killer had written in large letters and wrote next to it. Who wrote these instructions? Maybe you know the killer who killed the Rogers family. A reward of $25,000. At the end of the billboard, they put the police station number. This move was very strange and unique, and I don't think anyone had used this move before to solve the crime. This is the first of its kind, that you publish the criminal's handwriting on billboards. Imagine that this move bore fruit. This woman in front of you is called Joan Stevie. Look at the strange coincidence. Her name is the same as the name of the murdered mother, and she is the one who will cause the case to be solved. This woman was walking in the street one day and saw one of the billboards that the police hung up the signs with the criminal's handwriting on them, and as soon as she saw them, she recognized the handwriting because the handwriting was distinctive, and immediately called the police and told them, "This handwriting is similar to the handwriting of a contractor who worked in my house before, and I have invoices from him with a plan to come and check them out." So the investigators went to her, and she told them that a while ago she dealt with a contractor who works in the aluminum field, and he asked her some jobs in the house and gave her invoices, and she is sure that his handwriting in these invoices is similar to the handwriting on the billboard. This woman, after they told her that this man's personality was strange, and he always spoke in a suspicious way, as if he was lying all the time, and her experience with him was bad, the investigators took the invoices from her and sent them to the forensic expert, who specializes in identifying handwriting, and with one quick look, the expert knew that these 2 handwritings were perfectly identical. She found a capital letter T in the middle of many words. The letter T looks exactly the same, and she also found the letters Y and their various strange shapes. The matter, there was no doubt, the person who wrote the invoice is the same person who wrote the directions for the hotel location. So the police immediately went to him and arrested him, and if there was any doubt before, then all doubt went away when they put up a picture, the drawing next to his face. The picture was identical. This criminal's name is Oba Chandler. He was 43 years old at the time. He was married, and imagine that he had 8 children from 7 different women, and he had an aluminum contracting company that did aluminum work in homes, such as sinks, doors, and such things. He also had a criminal record dating back to his teenage years, and this criminal record included 2 assaults on women, and he spent several years in prison for them. On top of all this, he had a blue and white boat. One of the strong pieces of evidence they got on him was the boat communications log. This log records radio calls made from any boat in the area to the coast, because these calls go through the Coast Guard or a communication center for boats that are at sea. The logs confirmed that his boat was at sea at the time of the crime, because this criminal apparently called his wife after he finished the crime to tell her that he was having problems with the boat and that he would be late returning. Oba Chandler, of course, denied the charge and said that he was innocent. But after they arrested him, the police brought the most important witness who can be identified is the Chaldean girl who was assaulted on the boat. They saw her picture with a group of pictures of other people, meaning they did not bring. She took her own picture and asked her if this was him or not. They put it with the group of pictures to make sure that she really recognized him. Quickly and without hesitation, the girl pointed to her picture and said, "This is him, I'm sure." A clear reaction of fear and disgust appeared on her face and on her features, so that the police could be more sure. Then they brought Oba Chandler and made him stand with other people in a line so that the girl could see him in front of her eyes and recognize him directly. The same thing happened to him. Without hesitation, she pointed to him, and she was sure. The investigators then decided to go and search Oba Chandler's boat, but they were surprised that he had sold it. He sold it only 3 months after the crime he committed, most likely to get rid of any possible evidence that was present. The investigators still wanted more evidence so that their case against him would be solid and strong. Of course, they examined this paper, which was a map, and had directions for the hotel's location written on it. After examining it, they obtained several fingerprints. They discovered that most of these fingerprints belonged to the victims, the mother, and her daughters. But there was a large handprint on the paper. We don't talk about it. About fingerprints, we are talking about the palm print. It seems that when he was writing on the paper, he held the paper with the palm of his hand and began to write on it. The palm of his hand was printed on the paper. When they compared this palm print that they found on the paper with Obituary Chandler's fingerprint, they found a perfect match. This means that other than the line that they were sure was the line of his palm print, it was on the paper. That's it. They feel that they don't need additional evidence. Obituary Chandler stood in court before the judge, the jury, and the prosecutor. He presented the evidence they had against him. Obituary Chandler insisted that he was innocent, but the evidence against him was strong. They wrote his palm print on the paper. In order to evade and get out of this particular piece of evidence, he told them the real story. He told them that he met Joan and her daughters at a gas station. The mother, by the looks of it, was lost and did not know the directions, so she called him and asked him for help. He took this paper from her, which was a map, and wrote directions on it to the location of the hotel. This is all that happened between them. According to the prosecutors, the investigators believed this story, but they did not believe that he was telling them the whole truth. They were sure that after he gave the mother these directions for the hotel location, he started chatting with her and showing himself as a nice, kind man. Then, he most likely told them that he had a business and took tourists on sea trips at sunset and offered them to go out with him. He kept telling them that it was a beautiful scene in the middle of the sea and at sunset, and that they would enjoy themselves. Most likely, the little girls got excited. Then, the mother took out a piece of paper and wrote on it the directions for the port location that Oba Chandler had given her. She wrote the important information next to it, blue and white, which indicated the color of the boat. Then, Oba Chandler told the mother that they would meet him there at the port an hour before sunset. That evening, they met at the designated place at the port on time and took him out on the boat. Then, he started moving. Most likely, when they were in the middle of the sea, in a place far from the coast and far from anyone around them, this criminal took out a knife and started threatening them. Of course, they were in an isolated place like this, and he did not even know how to swim. They had no choice but to obey. The criminal caught them and tied them with the yellow rope that we talked about before, and after that he most likely assaulted them. And when he finished, he tied their legs with cement blocks and threw them into the sea while they were still alive. He didn't even bother to kill them. He threw them while they were alive and left them to drown. He didn't even cover their eyes. So the last one he threw, who was most likely the mother, saw her daughters being thrown in front of her. So why would this criminal get rid of them in this hideous way? The answer was with one of the witnesses, presented by the public prosecutor on the stand during the trial. This witness was a prisoner and a colleague of Chandler's playmate in detention. After the police arrested them, the prisoners always knew them, and they always chatted among themselves. It seems that Oba felt comfortable among these prisoners, all of whom were criminals, and he was one of them, and among them. So he started talking about his crimes and bragged that once he assaulted a foreign woman on his boat in the middle of the sea. Of course, he was talking about the Canadian girl. And once his cellmate said that he assaulted 2 girls and their mother in the middle of the sea. He wouldn't have been in prison if one of these girls hadn't tried to resist. This is the testimony presented by his cellmate. He told him this. So most likely, the reason that made Chandler's playmate kill the mother and her daughters was because one of them resisted him. Maybe if she hadn't resisted, he would have released them, if he had abused them like the Canadian girl. So, the testimony of his cellmate in prison increased the evidence against her. And there were many witnesses who came forward to the court, including even one of Oba's daughters and her husband, who they said that Oba visited them once in their house on a surprise visit, and literally confessed to the crime, and told them that he was trying to hide from the police because they were looking for him. Of course, for your information, Oba not only sold his boat after the crime, but he also moved out of his house. He and his family left, and lived in another area because news of the crime was widespread, and after the drawing that showed her facial features was widespread. Anyway, after the public prosecutor presented the evidence he had, and after they heard the testimonies of the witnesses, the jury took only an hour and a half to consult among themselves and immediately found guilty. So the judge decided that he was guilty and sentenced him to the death penalty. Yes, Florida is one of the American states that had the death penalty and still exists and has not been abolished to this day, but Oba Chandler remained in prison for many years before he was executed. I don't know, but I think the issue of the death penalty takes time, maybe so that they can make sure that he is actually guilty, or make sure that there is no additional evidence that could appear later and acquit him, especially since he never confessed to the crime, and our Egyptian remained innocent. So the death sentence against him was postponed a lot, especially since Florida went through changes in its methods. Execution. Before, they used to implement the death penalty by electric chair, but the electric chair was cancelled in the year 2000. This is the last date for his execution. But finally, after all these years, the date of his execution was set for November 15th, 2011. The method was by lethal injection. And on the day of the execution, Oba wrote a letter in which he said, "You are going to execute an innocent person today." So, until that moment, he was still claiming innocence, but this letter and all that extra talk didn't help him. and the execution was carried out. The strange part is that his criminal record didn't stop there. You might ask, how? Didn't he get executed? Yes, he was executed. But 4 years after his execution, in 2015, it was discovered that he was a serial killer. There was an unresolved case of a girl who was killed in 1990. The girl was only 20 years old when her body was found dumped on the side of one of the streets after she had been assaulted. Finally, in 2015, thanks to significant advances in forensic science and DNA analysis, they reopened the case and were able to match the DNA found on her body at the time with Oba Chandler's DNA, confirming that he was her killer. This means that this criminal turned out to be a serial killer. Who knows? He might be connected to other unsolved cases that remain open to this day, but at least justice was served, and he was executed. With that, we've reached the end of our story, and if you've reached this point and still haven't liked the video, I'm not mad at you.